Anyway, it's lovely to see you again, Sharon. Thanks for joining us. Having had our conversation a few weeks ago, it's nice to see you again. And I know you were quite keen at the end of our last conversation to talk a little bit more about something called brain fatigue. And now I know it's 4:30 in the UK in the Friday afternoon, and my brain feels pretty fatigued. We're out in the Rockies and it's in the morning, so hopefully not so much with you. But tell us a little bit about brain fatigue and maybe some of the strategies that we can adopt to help us through it.
Yeah, sure, Matthew. Thanks. It's good to be back. Yeah, so a lot of leaders that we work with often complain that they feel exhausted a lot. And it feels like physical exhaustion, when in fact it's more mental exhaustion because let's face it, they haven't been in the fields working all day, so it's a cognitive mental fatigue. And so physiologically, what's going on? There's a few things that's going on physiologically. So one of the things that happens is that we see an increase in something called adenosine. So adenosine, as that goes up in the brain, then that drives us towards fatigue. So that what happens is that we then feel less motivated to do anything that takes effort. So any effortful kind of brain activities, we have diminished motivation. Emotionally, we don't do as well. Our ability to make decisions and be creative is reduced. So adenosine goes up and dopamine actually drops because adenosine binds to a receptor in the brain that signals dopamine to go down. So dopamine is involved in learning and motivation as well.
This would be really critical if you're a leader who you feel physically exhausted, but actually it's mental exhaustion, and you're about to make some pretty important decisions. This is just this is the worst time, if you like, to start making those sort of decisions.
Exactly. So Friday afternoon at the end of a hard week is the last time that you want to make important decisions or anything like that. Yeah. So definitely cognitive function and cognitive performance are compromised when you're in this state. So yeah, it usually comes at the end of the day. So it builds throughout the day because you're using your brain, you're focusing a lot, and so this tends to build throughout the day. So there's a couple things that will bring this down. Well, there's a few strategies that we can talk about. The most important strategy, of course, being sleep. And so this increase in adenosine is part of the homeostatic sleep system. So as it goes up, the sleep drive goes up as well. And so getting a good night's rest, getting good sleep is what will bring it back down in the morning, back down overnight. So sleep is critical for that. Now, what's interesting is caffeine can also bind to these receptors that adenosine binds to. And so caffeine can kind of give us a little bit of a cognitive lift. But caffeine, of course, is a double-edged sword. And so because the half-life of caffeine is so long, it's 5 to 8 hours, then it can really wreak havoc with a good night's sleep. And so a lot of people, they reinforce themselves or their energy with caffeine, but then they don't sleep well. And so you have something called wired and tired, which I think a lot of people experience.
So you see people sort of trying to focus late into the evening, drinking lots of coffee. They've almost got a bit of an extra kick, but actually it just whacks them a little bit later on.
Yeah. So long term, it's going to hurt you. Short term, it might give you a little bit of a boost, but long term, you just get into this very vicious cycle. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So sleep is important. Another thing that can be helpful is getting outside in nature, or bringing nature into the office. And what we're seeing now is a trend in companies to actually to build more nature-filled work environments, whether they get people outside or whether they bring nature inside. And so there's something called ART, or ART, and it stands for Attention Recovery Theory. And so the way that we think this works is that there's two types of attention. There's attention that takes a lot of mental energy. It's what they call directed attention. So this is what we typically use during the workday.
Yeah.
And then we have something called involuntary attention. So involuntary attention is captured by inherently intriguing stimuli. So if you think about looking at a sunset, looking at beautiful mountains over the ocean. So this is sort of an involuntary thing that grabs our attention in a different way.
Right. And
what they found is that when we take time to allow our brains to go in this direction, that replenishes that directed and focused and voluntary attention, if that makes sense.
So often when, particularly in lockdown or when you're working from home and you've had endless Zoom meetings, you often hear people make is, I just had to get away from my desk and get out in the garden or go for a walk or just do something. I just needed to look at something differently. That's actually quite a good way of dealing with this, is what you're saying.
Yeah. And so there's been some interesting research looking at the effects of nature on cognitive function. They found that creativity goes up. There's less mental fatigue, obviously. There's less rumination or stress. So doing those nature breaks strategically throughout the day can really do an amazing job in terms of just that mental renewal and mental recovery. Yeah.
So we've got look after your sleep.
Yes.
If you have to drink coffee or caffeine, do so, but it's going to get you eventually. Have these sort of nature breaks in terms of just getting out and getting into fresh air and maybe looking at something that just triggers a whole different thought process in your mind, but something that you find attractive and interesting, and that's outside, outdoors.
So and then so there's a couple other things that we should pay attention to as well that can kind of help serve to derail us or not. Certainly some dietary factors that we talked about last time. So one of the things is if you eat a very rich meal, something that's high in fat, right. We see something called postprandial lipemia or lactescence.
Right.
So what that is if you eat a fatty meal and I take your blood and we spin it down, it's going to look cloudy and milky. And the problem with that is it causes the red blood cells to clump together.
Yeah.
And so it's called red blood cell aggregation. When that happens, blood flow slows way down. Yep. And it also loses their ability to give up oxygen. And so the brain is very reliant on oxygen and blood flow for it to function properly. And so this is what we think happens when people have something called brain fog. And so that what we eat is particularly important. Now, to counter that, we can eat foods that are rich in nitrates. So nitrate-rich foods are not processed meat, so that has a different mechanism. That's actually bad for us, obviously. But to eat leafy greens. So leafy greens are particularly high in nitrates. And what they do, they've done studies where they've taken brain scans or pictures of the brain and looked at changes in blood flow to the brain. And so these nitrates have been shown to do this. In particular areas of the brain that are vulnerable to lack of blood flow. And so anytime you have an increase in blood flow to these areas in the brain, your brain just functions so much better. And so getting the nutrients and getting the substrates and the oxygen to the brain is really critically important for brain recovery and brain function. Yeah.
So even if you had a good night's sleep and you hung off drinking the coffee, probably gone for an early morning walk, if you then end up in a fast food takeaway and have an enormously fat-enriched breakfast,
exactly,
the brain fog will still kick in.
Exactly.
Or could kick in. Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah. And they've done, there was an animal study where they looked at animals and they had them exercise and they fed them a high-fat diet. And they did exactly that. And it completely negated the benefits of the exercise. So they just weren't able to function very well from a cognitive perspective. Yeah.
So if you're like me and you go out for a run and you come back and then raid the fridge because you feel hungry and you want to stuff yourself with cheese and all the other stuff, then anything I've been doing out running, basically from my brain function point of view, is a bit of a waste of time, or it's not going to have the positive impact that I'm hoping it's going to have.
Exactly. Yeah.
Great. Anything else you should be watching out for?
Yeah, so I would say a final strategy that many leaders incorporate or starting to incorporate is meditation. Right. And so meditation actually slows neural activity. It brings you into the present, so it relieves you of worry of the past and anxiety about the future. And so it can also increase, it actually, there's a transcription factor called REST, oddly enough, REST. And what that does, it reduces neural excitation. And so this is good from just a longevity perspective. They found that people live longer if they can kind of slow down some of that neural excitation and neural activity. But if we can slow our brains down a little bit every once in a while throughout the day, then we're not going to go burn through substrates like glucose and increase that adenosine quite as quickly. And so whatever form that meditation looks like, whether it's deep breathing exercises or working in the garden or doing some slow stretching, just bringing yourself into the present and slowing things down periodically throughout the day can really help. Yeah. Great.
So just if with my brain fatigue, if I can remember this, so really pay attention to sleep.
Sleep. Yep.
Don't rely on caffeine to give you that brain function boost, because it might have a short-term impact, but it won't longer term.
Yeah.
Try to avoid eating sort of large meals, fatty meals which have a high level of fat in them.
Eat more greens.
Sorry?
Eat more greens.
Eat more greens. Get outside, have breaks, get outside in fresh air and in nature regularly during the day, and find moments during the day when you can just give your brain a rest by maybe meditating or doing something that just brings you back into the present and just takes you away from that intensity that you've perhaps been dealing with.
Yep.
Yeah?
Yeah, very good.
Right. Okay, so
Friday afternoon.
We've all got to practice this now. That's the key thing. Sharon, thank you so much indeed for sharing that with us. And I just sense I'm going to have to come back to you again because there seems to be an awful lot more to this than meets the eye. But if we can just help people think about those things for the moment, hopefully we're doing them a service, and hopefully there'll be better decisions being made and less brain fatigue.
Exactly. So I do have a paper that I wrote on this, so I'm happy to share if you want to post that.
Wonderful. Yeah, that would be wonderful.
Yep.
So we'll put a link on Let's Talk Leadership, and then and is that a link back to your own website, or is that a link direct to the paper? How do you want to do this?
I can send you the paper, and however you want to.
Put a link to it on the Let's Talk Leadership website.
Yeah. Perfect.
Sharon, it's fabulous to see you.
Likewise.
And enjoy the rest of your Friday. I'm heading off to get some exercise, I think now.
All right.
Avoid the coffee. But it's great to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us on Let's Talk Leadership.
All right, brilliant. Thanks, Matthew. It's been a pleasure, as always.